of all, hope that you feel free to ask questions and to engage and let us know what you think about this presentation, how you think we can help you in your everyday work. And we just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend with us. And there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to hand it off to my friends, Kimberly, Catherine.
Great. Thank you, Mary Helen. It's really great to be with you today, and I'm going to say a little bit about myself before we get into this. But really, I think about where I'd like to start is we always sort of want to know what you hope to get from today's session. And if you want to type in the chat just a word or phrase, maybe you were just hoping to learn something new while you eat your lunch, or be in this community. We might surprise you a little bit because we might engage you given the topic. It's going to be a little more than presentation, but you have some time for that. But if you could just put in the chat while I do my little intro, we'd love to hear from you, and Catherine's going to help read off some things. But I'm going to give you a minute and just say a little bit about myself. I just got back from a study abroad program in South Africa where we used a lot of images in our introduction and our work. We did it on storytelling. So I'm carrying that over to this. You can see in the upper left, that's a picture of us on study abroad. So some of the things that I think do define me are that story work. That's very important to me. I am half Brazilian, and so it's a very big year because right now in Atlanta, we're getting ready for World Cup that is coming next year. I'm not a fan of all the road work happening, but when I'm trying to get to work, but I am a fan that it's going to make its way here. And there's just some other things. I'm a condo farmer, and here are some things that have really influenced my thinking. And more than anything, I grew up on the water, and one of the things, even more than all my training, that influences how I view the world is really being near the ocean when I can. So I'm curious what you've learned so far, Catherine, in the chat. I do see there are some chat. What are people saying?
Yeah, it looks like everybody's just really excited to learn some new strategies today, get some new ideas, be able to reinvigorate their meetings and engagement with community partners.
Great. That sounds good. Hopefully you'll be able to learn from each other a little bit, just as much as a few things from what we're going to share. And we're going to, we really have a few objectives today. One is to really think about, who is a facilitator of a meeting. And I really see that as someone who helps a group work together. So we've already kind of achieved objective one in thinking about that, but we'll play that out a little bit. Describe some ways to engage meeting participants to get to great ideas and solutions. You're going to observe at least one facilitation practice. We are going to use this kind of umbrella of liberating structures, but not everything is called a liberating structure, and we'll get to what that means. And also, you're going to participate in at least two of these practices. So part of kind of shaking things up a little bit is to get us all involved. So I want to say something about what does that even mean? And you can actually go to the Liberating Structures website. And the great thing about it is there is a book, but in fact, there is,
I don't hear you.
sorry? Oh, I think somebody was off of mute. Um, so you can actually go to their website. One of the things that I love about this is it really is oriented to practice and practitioners. And on the right-hand side, you see there are these 33 facilitation practices. And I have fun sometimes just clicking through, looking at what they are and thinking about how to apply them in my work. So for a long time, I worked with communities doing program evaluation, and I have kind of a real passion for working with groups, thinking about how do we use information to develop our strategy, to think about our goals, and certainly evaluation. So later in this series, I'll actually be talking about that. And a lot of that has to do with how do we facilitate groups. to look at information, to be able to think about it, and as a group in an organization to make decisions about it. So I really like this as a way to think about meetings themselves. And what do we mean by meetings? I'm going to use that term meetings, but we might have an idea of what that means. But it often is really just the gathering of two or more people around some intention. So I think it's nice when our meetings have a purpose and it has a certain outcome when we're in our work context. But there are often things that we know, like staff meetings, community events. I use these practices in my classroom, in healthcare settings, strategy settings, collaboratives, and we work with the community advisory board. So we are now talking about integrating some ideas for that, and certainly use other kinds of facilitation practices. But meetings really aren't just a sort of a typical, we might think of number one, like a staff meeting as a meeting. There are all of these kinds of events where we bring people together. And liberating structures in particular, but often just thinking about people who work in the facilitation space, trying to help groups come together, think about ideas. There are some challenges with that. One is listening is really hard. We're now in a virtual space. It's particularly hard. But it's also just human nature that when we're in conversation, we may be listening some, but we're also thinking about what we're going to say. So sometimes having ways to help us just pause and listen is helpful. There's always power dynamics present. And input and interaction is sometimes managed by one person, and that works for many meetings, right? It's facilitated by a leader. And that person is kind of managing what the dialogue looks like, the topics, how we interact with each other. But what we're going to focus on in this brief time is really when we are coming together and meeting, because we need to focus on ideas and solutions. And there's some other challenges that happen sometimes in our work, right? We can forget to ask the people who probably have like the greatest ideas about what solutions might be. We might focus on blame if we're looking at work, like what we've already done, how can we improve? And there might be kind of a default to look at, well, whose fault is it that this didn't work exactly the way we want? Or we might get stuck on how to actually use information to do something. And that's an area where I've really spent a lot of time with groups. And I find that these practices are really helpful with that. So I'd like to just say one more thing and then maybe engage a little bit with my partners on the call here. And that is the assumption here is that we can create meetings to promote more engagement and inclusion. And I think this is something probably all of you know and do in some way. And so this is a particular way to think about it. And that is in Liberating Structures, they really talk about there are these different elements that we have. It's how we get started, our invitation to people to participate, our meeting space. So we're in a virtual space now. A lot of what we're going to talk about were originally developed in person, so they've been adapted. There's kind of an ordering of things and timing, how we set up groups, and then ultimately how we engage in our participation. And the idea here is we can tweak any of these, right? We can have little tweaks. We can create big changes, but often it's starting with little tweaks to all of this. So just right off the bat, I'm really curious, and I've asked Catherine and Mary Helen if maybe they would just spend 5 minutes and talk about a meeting that you've been a part of in the past month, where most of the participants were engaged. And maybe you could, share how it was structured, what did participation look like, and who didn't participate, and why you think that. And so I'm going to time it. We are on a tight schedule, but for the rest of us, we'll kind of listen to the conversation and feel free to type questions or comments in the chat that you have for them. And we'll come back around to that when they start. So, Catherine and Mary Helen, are you ready for your conversation?
Yeah,
Great. Whoever wants to start.
I can start.
Yeah.
I would say our community advisory board meetings recently have been really engaging. We've had a lot of people talking during the discussion portions, and I think those have worked well in part because everyone knows each other so well. And so, one of the louder people in the group will start talking about an issue. And, we've been talking about topics and issues in the community. And they'll sort of hand it over to somebody who they know is dealing with something similar. And they'll just sort of hand it around the room themselves. So it doesn't even necessarily need facilitation, which I think is kind of an amazing thing to watch with a group that knows each other so well. And I think honestly, everyone participated, some more reluctantly than others. They get kind of called out by other people in the meeting. But I do think that that worked pretty well. And I know, Mary Helen, you've been at those meetings, so feel free to add on to what I just said.
Yeah, I don't think it always started that way. I'm glad that you feel that way about how they go. And I think obviously because people do know each other well, most people, and there we do have some new people on our community advisory board. So um, I hope that over time they will feel as, willing to engage. And it's interesting because that group, we've had some really hard things to talk about. The community that we serve has been really through very difficult circumstances. We've had the death of one of our community advisory board leaders, actually our co-chair. We've had some really difficult topics and moments, and we had a pandemic. So we had apartment fires, and we had lots of sad, hard things. Maybe that had something to do with how people feel about each other. I do think, in my experience, and I don't know how you feel about it, Catherine, but it is different than a lot of the other meetings I attend.
Definitely.
So I feel like we hear from more people on that meeting than I do maybe in some of the other meetings that I participate in.
Mm.
Um, it feels a little more egalitarian, like I don't know. You're newer to it than I am, so I'm interested to know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think especially the more recent ones, it's taken us a while, I think, to find our footing. But starting off those meetings with an open discussion of, what are the issues, what are, the successes and issues that you all are facing in your work and in your community, and starting the meetings off that way seems to have opened people up to talking a little bit more. And I think we're, as a group, really interested in hearing what's going on within the community. So that's great, I think, for both parties, everyone who's participating to be able to relate to each other and for us to be able to hear that as well.
I have to also call you out a little bit because you've done such an excellent job, and maybe people don't think about this when they have meetings, but you prepare us. So we have a meeting before the meeting, and you are very excellent about keeping us organized and pushing us to make sure that we kind of think about what we're going to talk about before, and we make decisions before the meeting. It takes more time, but I think it's really helped a lot. So I have to give you huge props and credit because taking the time to make sure the facilitators are both there and everybody's ready and there are assignments has made a big difference. And I feel like our meetings, and even though they're virtual, which I sometimes think is not as wonderful as being in person, I have heard that from others that our CAB meetings are effective and helpful for, I hope, just because we're the kind of some of the leaders and facilitators of that meeting, I hope other people that participate feel like they're helpful too. But I think having somebody intentionally plan everything has been amazing. It also keeps us on time, which I know people respect.
That's very important.
Well, we're almost at time, but I just wondered, was there any thought about who you think might not participate and why that is in the last, say, 30 seconds or so we had?
I'll let Mary Helen go. You're more efficient.
I think people who are newer probably are not as comfortable. I still think that we struggle with, we have so many different languages, and proficiency with English, I think, can sometimes be a hindrance. We are an academic group of people that are leading it, and maybe some people haven't felt as comfortable, but um, I think that's probably, the other thing is that we we meet at a time that is difficult for families and people who have families to be there. So even though people might want to be there and contribute, I think a lot of times people are like feeding their kids and trying to keep life going, which is difficult. But that's just off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. I'm curious if anyone, I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but any questions or comments that you have for Catherine and Mary Helen, our expert meeting goers that we have here? Feel free to put in the chat. You can also, we're not that big of a group if you wanted to come up, but if you want to just put it in the chat. I think one thing I'll just reflect back that I was hearing is this idea of self-facilitation, Catherine, that sometimes like what impresses you is that there doesn't even need to be an active facilitator because the connection itself really moves people forward. Sarah says, how do you structure the meetings, or is that something we'll hear more about? So your meetings, maybe you could just briefly talk about kind of how you set those up and any strategies that you use to engage people.
Yeah, so for the GSU Prevention Research Center, we actually have a whole community advisory board with like 25 people. We do currently have 2 co-chairs. And so what we do is we meet with the co-chairs, as Mary Helen mentioned, beforehand. And usually we come in with a topic, but we're always open to whatever the co-chairs feel is the most important topic to discuss at this time. There have been a lot of changes recently, and so, we've been open to talking about the current climate if that's really the most important thing to talk about. And the meetings are typically structured. What we found is having an open discussion in the beginning. So what's going on in the community, successes, challenges, let's all talk about it together. And then usually we move on to a research or prevention research center related topic with either presentation or discussion. But we found that opening it up with that open discussion seems to get people talking and excited. Mary Helen, feel free to add.
I would say the most important thing that we have done in terms of structuring it is that we gave the leadership of the meeting and the control over the agenda to 2 community advisory board members who co-chair it. So the community leads the meeting and they make the decisions about what we're going to talk about. Of course, we come to it with work that needs to be taken care of, but they prioritize the topics and they lead the meeting. It felt risky at first, and a large part of that success has been having somebody like Catherine bring us all together before the meeting, but it has paid off in so many ways that we can't even enumerate, but that was a big step. And I think that it also changed the tone of the meeting so that it's not a bunch of us who sit in Zoom meetings all day, and it gave the leadership over to our community partners, which was a big deal and the smartest thing I think we could have done.
Great. Thanks to you both. So we chose this because obviously we're here today to talk about meetings, but we also just wanted to start out with an example of what a structure is that you could use. And this particular format is sometimes called a fishbowl. Liberating Structures has a more technical term, but the idea is that we have people. We talked about meetings, but often they might be people like community organizers that you get together, 3, 4, 5 people that are talking about their experience, maybe doing outreach work in the community and what that looks like. And then a larger group that's listening can engage after that conversation. So of course, we're doing a very short version and we've kind of dropped this in on you. But we look forward to comments that you have later. But this is one example of a facilitation technique that you could use. And what I want to point out is there's some kind of invitation or opening. I asked them to tell us about a meeting that they've been a part of. Clearly, we're in a virtual space, and we have 2 participants in this case. Sometimes there are more. And then we had this structure of having the 2 of them start off, and then an opportunity for the rest of us to weigh in and ask questions in a short amount of time. So these 5 elements that I just talked through with the fishbowl are really consistent across all of the liberating structures, activities, or practices. And that is that you have these ideas of these are the things that you can actually kind of play with, but they have it there as a starting point for you to understand, well, what does this facilitation process look like? And we can adapt them to meet our needs. So these, again, were developed for in-person settings. They were developed for certain kinds of groups. So in a previous life, I worked with a lot of groups who had experienced violence. So a trauma-informed approach might adapt some of these in ways to sort of change some of the group interactions or the ordering and timing of things, or add things to check in with people before actually proceeding. And you might think about the groups that you work with and kind of things that might be most important to them for any kind of facilitation. So what we'd like to do now is to have you kind of be a part of the conversation, but we're going to ask you to wait to send anything in the chat. So what we'd like to hear from you about is, in your current work, what is one way we engage participants? So one way we engage participants is blank, and one way we'd like to improve meetings, meaning you, really. And if you type in the chat, one way you could actually structure it is to put, how you engage, comma, or improve, or if you want to, actually indicate one or the other. But just take a minute to think about that. We would love to have everybody type something, because when I say go, we're going to all hit send. And so that we'll see everything come together. And this is called a chatterfall. So again, just take about maybe 30 more seconds, take some time, think about it. And give about 10 more seconds, and then I'll just count down. Okay, so we're going to engage, improve. So on the count of 1, 3, 2, 1, now hit send. Okay. Great. So I'm seeing here we have icebreakers to engage, include a topic for discussion to gather feedback. Oh, CAB member spotlights at every meeting. So the community advisory board work. Okay. I'm seeing mostly engagement, but I do see one here. To engage is to provide space to contribute and improve with time management. Always an issue. We might even be grappling with that at this very moment. Engaging each other, doing some sharing, and an improvement might be to get more participation by more people. Sure. Using people's names to engage them and acknowledging their remarks and comments. Leaving space. I love silence for people to jump in and to feel less rushed might be an improvement. And then Kylie has engaged with introductions and improve in maybe agenda setting and defining a scope of a meeting. That can be really, really helpful. So one thing I just wanted to show here, this isn't a liberating structure. You may have done a chatterfall before, but one way that this can be helpful in a virtual space in particular and help things be a little more accessible and inclusive is some people do need a minute to think about things. And often when we're doing a more dynamic chat, you have the people like me who are going to go first and have something always to say. And then, right, other people who need a minute might be hanging back, reading what's in the chat. They might be influenced by it or feel like, okay, now we've moved past time to talk about it. So this can be one way actually to improve participation. I know we didn't get everyone, but by asking people to kind of take a minute and then do have a chatter fall as we talk about it. So thanks for those of you who shared. Even if you didn't, we're going to come back to this because we're going to ask you to share in smaller groups a little bit later. So, okay, so we've talked about the general idea, but specifically, what can liberating structures help with? So people talked about icebreakers. There are ideas and practices to help us get started or have icebreakers, to have a way to connect or net with participants, to learn from community experts. So I say experts in quotes because really everyone engaging in work, whether it's community organizing or in healthcare services or academia, we all bring, right, the expertise of doing the work day to day, right? And it can also help us reflect on what we've done. So a lot of what I do in my own work, in evaluation in particular, is looking at information and working with groups again to kind of reflect, here's what we've done, and then where do we want to go forward? How do we want to do that? And in particular, in identifying solutions or recommendations for how we can act. So just to note that we can use a single practice, and sometimes that's what I do, or you can use multiple practices, and you'll see people talk about the threading the beads. So each of these practices is like a little bead on a string, and you can kind of string them together to make an entire agenda out of a set of these practices, or you can integrate them into other agenda items. And on their website, they have great examples of different kinds of agendas where people have used liberating structures throughout, or have used them, kind of interspersed them in certain ways. So I want to talk a little bit about the practices that I use. There's certain ones that I really like, and I've used probably 25 of them. I haven't used all of the 33, but in some capacity, I've used many of them. And I use them both in right now in consulting work, in work, as I mentioned, with community groups, but I also use them in teaching a lot. So one that I really love is the celebrity interview. And I have a quick example, and then Mary Ellen Helen has an example. So the celebrity interview is a way when you invite a guest, instead of asking them to present on something, they're usually an expert on something, to set it up so you have an interviewer, and then you have questions from the audience. So they can share their expertise, but often it's a different way that is more engaging for participants. So I work with another university in helping students, maternal and child health students, learn about different professions. And then we invite a celebrity panel of people. And we kind of do a hybrid. We give them 5 minutes to do a little bit of presenting and talking, but then the rest of the time is an interview on how they got to where they are, and their leadership pathway, things that were most important. And a lot of those are questions that come directly from students. And so, Mary Helen, I know there's a celebrity that you would like to interview. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's not really even me. I think I'm doing it as a proxy for maybe some people on this call. But in all of this work, we get asked often, well, what's your secret to, grant writing? And Michael really has been so incredibly successful. He wrote one of the largest grants that Georgia State has received. And I mean, I think it's a question I get a lot, and I feel like I don't know anything about it. So even though I'm going to help facilitate a seminar about it, but if Michael were our celebrity interview, there are probably a lot of things that I would want to ask. Well, I do ask them all the time, but the number one question that I get asked a lot is about success in grant writing. And because he's been so successful, I would love to just put him on the spot and say, what do you think has been central to your success? And I think a lot of people, especially our community partners who would like to know about that. And then I think our students would have other questions. He's had a really interesting career in a lot of different spaces and venues, whether it's global public health or the work he did in HIV, just working for the WHO, Moffitt, CDC, all over the place. I don't think in the in the venues where we spend time working all the time, we've ever thought about, hey, Michael, let's ask you all these questions. And then I also like the Colbert Report. He always does those questions, those hilarious questions, like, what number am I thinking of? So just like the funny things. And Michael has a really good sense of humor. So when you brought that up, I was like, oh, he'd be a perfect person to do this technique with. Although I had never thought about doing it before, and I would, I plan to steal it and use it, which I guess is the point of this, right?
I guess I was muted, but yeah, that is the whole point. And some of what I resonate with is you can really get at like the how, like how he kind of found his way to these different things. I'm sure he could do a presentation, but I would imagine that people being able to ask things that are most important to them of someone like Michael, who was a dean of a school of public health, in addition, right, to leading the prevention research work before his retirement. I know he's transitioning into another role. I mean, what a great celebrity interview. And now when I invite guests, I often invite them, I give them the option, like if you want to present, you can, but we would really just love to interview you. And most people do prefer that. Some like to stick to presenting, but what a great format. Another structure that I use a lot, again, a lot of what I do is trying to act on information. And right now, it's such a, we all know that it's a really challenging time. And it's a time where we can certainly, and I've felt this way, feel some despair about like what can we actually do to change things. And so one of the things I like about some of these structures is they can help us kind of move from needing to have like the big answer or big solution all the time to think about like what, and they call it a 15% solution. So I'm going to talk about an example of that in acting on program information. I worked with in Mississippi with a program, the Child Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. So this was partly the state health department, but there was a whole coalition of healthcare providers, community groups, youth serving groups that are part of trying to address this issue in Mississippi. There's some particular issues. And so I worked with them and we got to the point where we learned a lot. We collected, we talked with people, we looked at their data, their information. And one of the things that we learned is that many families, particularly in the Delta, where there are a lot of older homes, where there are issues with lead paint and things like that, they actually rent their homes and apartments. So they don't actually control repairs. So some of what you do in lead poisoning remediation or repair is there are things that are low or no cost, like putting tack paper on places where there's paint peeling, but then there's things that require more, like actually repainting an entire building or removing structures. So the problem that we found when we started looking at this with the program is people really don't have control over those larger things. Landlords do. And so when we talked about this as a group, we can't mandate that landlords make repairs. I learned a lot about the laws. You actually can't, even if there's unhealthy things happening, you can't require landlords to do certain things, including removing lead, which I find really kind of remarkable. And we could have like stopped there. We knew, okay, this is not going to happen. But what we started to say is, well, what can we do without more resources or more authority? And what we had done is we had talked with two landlords that on their own had decided to make changes, make repairs and remediations. And we had a lot of information from them. And we said, well, what if we come up with some idea like a tip sheet where landlords are talking to landlords. So we might not be able to require certain things of landlords, but maybe people who have rental property will listen more to people on their own, and they'll learn things like it might actually be a cost savings for you in the long term, or things that from people who have similar values and similar interests. So we never said what's our 15% solution, but we did integrate this idea of like, what can we do without more resources or authority? And I've found this to be really helpful in a lot of the work that I do. I use this one a lot, and I use it in conjunction with other structures. So one is one of the roles that I have is I do teach in a DRPH program, and the students, they're the learners in that program, really are practitioners in public health. They're coming back and they're really focused on leadership training in particular. And so what we do in a course that we have that's really looking at kind of ethical considerations in their work is we use a combination of 3 structures to look at something that might be really important to them and have their peers consult on a current issue. So I'm going to talk through, and because the example is kind of broad reaching, I'm not going to get super specific, but I'm going to talk about sort of a general category of things that we use it for. So these are, again, professionals who are thinking through things in their own work context of how do I make decisions about a conflict? In this case, these are ethical dilemmas in our work. And there's 3 structures that we use. Don't get thrown off by the language. Troika Consulting, I don't even really know where Troika comes from. But it is very similar to that fishbowl, the what, so what, now what, and a 15% solution. What does that mean? So what if we have a question like, how do I allocate resources? So this comes up, how do I allocate resources to prevention versus some of our intervention strategies and services? That's kind of a common one. During COVID, it was really common of like, how do I decide who we actually focus on and try to reach, because major strategies might not be reaching them. And so I think we need to allocate resources to reaching certain groups. But we also want to make sure in public health, right, we try to reach whole populations. So these are some of the dilemmas that we have. And so the idea is that our peer or a group of our peers shares what the challenge is, right? And they present their situation. And then we have a group, which will be a group of the rest of us that actually listens. And after we hear, we can ask questions of what we call the client or the person presenting. We can ask them questions to clarify. And then as consultants in that role, we discuss amongst ourselves. I say ourselves, it's really them, but I'm usually facilitating this part. So they're not engaging the person who's just shared the issue at this point. They're just talking, and the person who presented is listening to what's really coming up for them, right? And the way that the structure that we use for them to do that is a what, so what, now what. I love this one. I use it in other contexts. But when the consultants discuss the issue, again, these are just peers, right? People who you work with. They say, well, what is really happening here? What are the facts? Because what we are quick to do is to kind of go to the analysis, but what are we really hearing? And then what might be important to focus on here? And then the idea is that the consultants come up with some kind of recommendations or actions that might be helpful. And so we kind of go through this process. And then the so-called client or the person who's presented the issue kind of listens as the consultants are deliberating, and they reflect on what was most helpful about that. And then we get to the 15% solution. So in this case, we do call it popcorn, which is we just pop ideas out, but this could be something that you go back and think about. And now you think about, okay, where do we actually have more discretion to add? We can actually take some action here. We don't need more resources or more authority. And so if we're trying to identify, well, how do we allocate resources in this way? Often where we get stuck is we don't have control over funding. It's uncertain. We don't know. We're not the decision maker about these final things. And so then kind of the conversation stops. And what this helps us do is, like, even if it is trying to influence the people who make the decisions, or try to think about, okay, what if we don't get additional funding? Are there things that we can still do right now that we might want to focus our resources on? So it's a way to kind of break things down into smaller pieces to help a group keep moving and stay in motion, even when things can be really challenging. So we, believe it or not, we are doing okay on time in terms of where we are landing now. So honestly, the takeaway really is, before we turn it back over to you, is that we can engage more participants more often in meetings. And again, I'm sure, knowing who some of the audience members are, this is something that you do and you're familiar with. So these are just some additional tools, right, to do that. We can do it with a big tweak, or we can do it with a little tweak. So that's, I think, another thing that can be helpful in thinking about. You don't have to change everything, but maybe just try one thing out. So we have talked about at our next cabinet, even breaking, doing things where you're in smaller groups, or doing things where you do have more kind of structured interaction might be helpful to generate ideas. These practices, they can stand alone, they can be used together and combined with other activities. So they're very flexible and practical that way. And I'm very aware that you might be using some or many of these practices already. It doesn't really matter what we call them. And so again, if you go to the website, they might use certain terms, but they also have descriptions by those 5 elements that I showed that help it make a little more concrete. And I tend to take those and then I translate it into whatever language for the audience that I'm working with and use that. Okay, so what I think we'd like to do, because we do actually have 15 minutes, we're just going to ask you for 5 minutes to engage with others and to practice liberating structure. Maybe Catherine, you could help me with, I see 24 participants, but I think we might just do groups of 3 and not, let's see if we can do that in breakout rooms.
Sure. Do you have the controls pulled up or should I do that?
Let's see. I think I could probably do that.
Perfect.
So 3, if I can do my math.
Hmm.
Let's see here. And I'm just gonna double check because I might not move you to one unless you'd like to be
Yeah,
part of the breakout.
That's fine.
Okay.
Whatever makes the groups work better. And will we be coming back after these groups to talk?
Yes, we are going to come back. We're just going to spend about 5 minutes. So, what we're going to do is think about actually, if you could put in the chat it's on the agenda. So one way you have already thought about, or at the beginning, we put in the chat, one way that you can make your meetings more engaging or inclusive. So what if you thought about this, you share with you're going to have 2 other partners at least. What's one way you want to make your meetings more engaging or inclusive? Maybe there's a barrier to doing that. What's your 15% solution? What can you do to kind of face this challenge without more resources or authority? And then maybe even if you have time, think about if you were 10 times bolder, what would you suggest for the meeting? And this is kind of another strategy, but so the takeaway is you're going to share something that you would like to make meetings more engaging or inclusive, and maybe a challenge to that. How you might address that challenge. What's one maybe smaller thing that you could do? And then maybe something if you were bolder, take a bolder action. So with that, I'm gonna open the rooms. And again, maybe monitor yourself since we have about 5 minutes for this to go around. And Catherine and Mary Helen, you might just not join the room. Yeah, okay. Oh, there are people. I think that's fine. Some people.
You should see a pop-up on your screen that invites you to join a room. So if you'll click join, it'll put you in there.
All right. Oh, I think Mary Helen went to a room,
That's okay.
which is totally fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we get back, we are going to have, at least 5-6 minutes.
Mhm.
And we could I was just going to ask something that they learned.
Yeah.
And then any final questions.
Perfect. And I'll put in the chat that I'll be sharing the slides later today with everyone who participated, and that the recording can be made available upon request. I think I started the
Did we
recording in the
stop the
cloud.
recording? Sorry.
No.
Or one thing that you can try. So we'd love to hear about that. And we have about 6 minutes left. So I'll just roll into also any questions that you have. And Catherine, maybe you could help. Let's see. Ooh, share ideas. Okay, Sarah, thank you. Using breakout rooms and reporting back. So yes. So people sometimes are much more comfortable in small groups. And yeah, and then sometimes you can end up with people who are fun to talk to when you're in smaller groups. Great. Oh, so Sophia shared, so we have great that we have CAB members on here. How they highlight the community advisory board members at each meeting and give them space to share their work in a great way. So to highlight the experts in the room, I love that. Yeah, so Erin raised this idea of like having more engagement with community members. It seems to make sense, but then you're also asking people to do more work. So maybe thinking about ways that aren't such a big burden on someone, or maybe identifying people that actually might enjoy having more of an active facilitator role, but certainly a consideration of asking people to do more. Yeah, anything else? People have, yeah. Great. What about anything that you think you want to try when you go back? So anything that you've heard about today?
It looks like in the chat, the celebrity interview has already been mentioned as something that would be interesting. And then, the breakout rooms we tried today, as well as the co-chair facilitation, seem like the three that have come up in the chat from the other comments. Anything else? Feel free to unmute yourself as well.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I encourage everyone to to look at the website if you're interested and explore on your own. And again, the idea is that they should be practical and you shouldn't need a lot of training to be able to use them. And I see one more comment.
Please provide me with the website you are referring to.
Sorry. And so fun working with other people in the Prevention Research Center network and to see members that are here. Is this Mary Helen? Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's so
I was
many
like-
people from other PRCs, network
Yeah.
PRCs in our call today. And it gives my heart a lot of hope that everybody's continuing this work despite very uncertain times. And we met another person from Kansas, and this was like really kind of the highlight of my summer to see people just keep
Oh,
doing this work in this really hard time. So thank you guys all for being here. I'm gonna let you close it out, Kimberly, but I've got a few things. I'm ready to go.
great.
Thank you.
Well, it is, we are almost at time and it's been a pleasure to be with you. I hope there are some things that maybe have inspired you in the talking in the small groups or just potential activities that you can engage in. But to Mary, I want to echo Mary Helen's sentiment. Sometimes what's most inspiring is just being with people who you have a connection with because you're trying to do this work. And so thank you all for taking the time to be here. And just a reminder that we do have 3 more webinars coming up, right, in the next few weeks. So the next one will be on, I believe, rapid feedback and evaluation. I'll be doing that one. So
July 22nd.
okay, so I look forward to seeing you then. So